just wanted to underscore that while we are members of the Climate Council, and we're going to talk to you about sort of where the work stands, we are not representing the Climate Council today. The goal of this webinar is to ground you again a bit more in the work underway, to update the initial climate action plan in service of trying to get public input into this process, because a new plan is due by July 1st of 2025. Can you make that full screen, Evelyn? Awesome, thanks. So in moments, again, you're going to hear very quickly about some of the priority actions under consideration. Again, these are draft recommendations and actions that the council will be considering and seeking further public input on throughout April, and as the plan continues to be finalized and evolve until it's due to be wrapped up by July 1st. So I want to provide a little context, but before I do that, I just want to let you know in terms of our agenda today, we're going to hear first from Jared Duval, who is on the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, which is focused on the transportation, thermal, power, and industrial sector. Then we're going to hear from Jael Pulskamp, who serves on the agriculture and ecosystem subcommittee. And then we will hear from David Mears, who is a member of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee. We're going to try and get to questions from you all, so please do drop your questions as they arise in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as possible. And then we want to wrap with just a brief overview of the actual public engagement opportunities happening, led by the Climate Action Office and the Climate Council in April and on May 1st. So next slide, please, Evelyn. So just a little bit of grounding framework for you all. As you probably know well, the Global Warming Solutions Act turned our now 20-year climate pollution reduction goals into requirements in 2020. And the Global Warming Solutions Act outlined a process led by a 23-member appointed Climate Council under the guidance of the Agency of Natural Resources and its Climate Action Office. And the GWSA tasked the Climate Council with coming up with a plan that reduces planet warming pollution in line with globally accepted climate science, while also identifying key resilience and adaptation strategies, and critically ensuring that Vermont undertakes climate action and charts a clean energy transition that is grounded in justice and equity. So these are the 5 big buckets of sort of the focal point of the Climate Council. So really, again, cutting climate pollution, which is the sort of legal mandate that the GWSA needs to meet, but also offers a really broad and important focus on resilience and adaptation, because we know our planet is warming. That has, as we all know well, had very significant impacts already. And those are costly and consequential, and there's a need to help our communities adapt in a warming world. So we're going to get into it, but before I punt, one other important context. Can you advance the slide, Evelyn, please? That the work of the sort of 3 sort of issue area subcommittees of the council is just sort of grounded, and recommended strategies and actions are analyzed through sort of these 5 sets of criteria with technical feasibility, cost effectiveness, progress towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, realizing co-benefits, and really critically sort of through a justice and equity lens. I'm grateful for the leadership of the Just Transition Subcommittee that has developed some really important guiding principles for this work and for broader work across Vermont. I think this is really important work, and these principles are intended to guide us as we overlay them with the recommendations, as well as through sort of the process that the Climate Council is helping lead with members of the Just Transition Subcommittee and others. So there's a lot to dig into. Just wanted to share that little bit of a broad focus. I'm going to encourage you again to put your name and affiliation in the chat. And as we turn it over to the members of the subcommittees, I encourage you to write your questions in the chat as well, and we'll get to as many as possible. But Until then, I'm going to turn it over to Jared Duval, who is a member of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, to talk about very high level, what are the draft recommendations under consideration in that subcommittee. So thanks so much, Jared. Take it away.
Thanks, Joey. Thank you for hosting this, VECAN and the Association of Conservation Commissions. Really glad to be with all of you today, and thanks for being here. I'm really looking forward to the questions and thoughts that folks may share. But before we get to that, I'm just going to provide an overall review of some of the draft recommendations, specifically with regard to pollution reduction strategies that have emerged out of the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. And before I get to the specific substance of those draft recommendations, I want to talk a little bit about our process, which was that there were subcommittee members and task groups that engaged in really extensive research to identify what has worked here in Vermont and also what has worked in other states and countries around the world, given our charge as a climate council in line with the obligations of the Solutions Act to confidently, cost effectively, and equitably do our part to reduce climate pollution in line with science-based targets. And there were a small number of policies that kept showing up as being able to confidently, cost effectively, and equitably reduce emissions, and that have been proven effective to do so. And those were broadly cap and invest policies. That will be a theme that you will see. Establishing performance standards on equipment or vehicles or fuels. And those were really the two buckets. Now, there's no silver bullet to climate policy, maybe silver buckshot. And so a lot of this has to happen in a complementary way. But we also wanted to focus on what are those foundational pillars that we know are very likely necessary if we're going to confidently meet our legal obligations, both to cut pollution and to save Vermonters money and help cut energy costs. So in the thermal sector, which is one of the two highest climate polluting sectors in Vermont alongside transportation, there were two main policy options that were identified by the subcommittee. They could be done in tandem, or one could advance. So this is an either or either or both approach. So the first would be the policy option that had significant development in the first climate action plan, and then later by the legislature and the Public Utility Commission, with significant revision, which would be a modified clean heat standard, addressing the core concern that has emerged about that, which was the question of uncertainty in terms of the price effects that fossil fuel corporations would pass on to customers by having to comply with pollution reduction obligations. You know, there were estimates anywhere from 1 cent a gallon a year in professional analysis that was commissioned by the Agency of Natural Resources to fossil fuel industry groups sharing much higher estimates. And so to give folks confidence, the idea of establishing a specific price cap with a starting credit price to help provide that clarity is something that the committee put forward as a draft option. The second would be to provide clarity via an emissions cap and invest program, capping the amount of emissions that are allowed statewide from polluting sectors, charging the polluting entities that are responsible for importing the polluting fuels an allowance fee that can then be used, that revenue, to directly provide rebates to low and middle income Vermonters to keep them whole or make sure that they come out ahead. It's a way to directly address some of the affordability and cost effectiveness concerns, but also as a revenue source to invest in further pollution reduction activity, which can again be targeted to support the folks who most need the help in overcoming upfront cost hurdles in order to do things like weatherize homes, get into more efficient and cleaner vehicles and heating systems, etc. And then finally, there was this question of what to do about the carbon content of fuels, and recognizing that there are opportunities as we move towards, as much as possible, towards an efficient electric future for our water and space heating, that there in the meantime is going to need to continue to be some sources of combustion and in combustion equipment. And when that happens, how can we incentivize the cleanest burning fuels rather than the dirtiest? And two options were put forward there: either a clean fuel standard or a fuel blending requirement, which is what the Public Utility Commission recommended. So next slide, please, Evelyn. Thanks. We also recognize that we need to secure sustainable funding for weatherization for low and moderate income households. That target is still being revised based on updated analysis. It was previously 120,000 homes by 2030. We are going back to look at the technical feasibility of that number and how it aligns with other targets in our emissions reduction pathways analysis. Recognition of a need to secure funding for the electrification of space and water heating for low and moderate income households. We have seen data that a lot of upper income Vermonters are already making changes that allow them to save money over time. But that if we don't provide the support in the form of grants, incentives, et cetera, to be able to help low and moderate income Vermonters overcome that upfront cost hurdle, we run the risk of deepening energy and economic inequities in the state. And then we also recommend a study that would look at the possibilities around emissions-based equipment standards, similar to what has been used for a long time for efficiency standards of equipment like refrigerators and other appliances, and also similar to the equipment-based standards that exist for vehicles known as the Advanced Clean Car 2 rules. What can we do to establish standards to avoid locking in pollution and high costs from a consumer protection perspective of water and space heating equipment? That's an area of investigation that we are recommending. Next slide, please. So no surprise here. Mirroring what was recommended on the thermal side, the transportation sector, our other largest source of climate pollution in Vermont, a recommendation of a cap and invest policy to reduce emissions. This is actually consistent with the first recommendation in the primary transportation policy recommendation in the initial climate action plan, which was to join the Transportation and Climate Initiative, a cap and invest program that was designed to be done in partnership with other states. But that kind of fell apart in 2020. And so now we are looking at the other options that exist in this space, including the Western Climate Initiative, which includes Quebec and California, potentially joining them in a cap and invest program, or joining New York as they develop a cap and invest program. And I think it's important to note that while these recommendations kind of came up sector by sector, both the transportation task group and the buildings task group recognized that a cap and invest program could cover either or both and be a multi-sector kind of economy-wide cap and invest program. Also, recognition of the need for sustainable investment in efficient transportation choices, including transit, microtransit, biking and walking, et cetera. We can go to the next slide. The largest single recommendation in terms of climate pollution reduction that has advanced since the adoption of the initial climate action plan is the rules around Advanced Clean Cars 2. And this is Vermont joining California and other states in setting standards that are higher than the federal standards to ensure that we are moving towards more and more zero emissions and electric vehicles being delivered to Vermont for Vermonters to purchase and use, so that we can both reduce pollution and costs. There are questions about when and how that will be challenged by the current federal administration. So we are recommending that we continue to monitor and maintain that necessary authority to follow the higher level standards that will help advance pollution reduction and cost saving efforts on a faster timeline than if it is not in place. We recognize again from a affordability and equity perspective that there needs to be sufficient funding to enable continued. Right now, they are unfortunately paused or fully expended. So we need to find the funds to be able to resuscitate EV incentives for low and moderate income car purchasers, both used and new vehicles, and again on the transit side. And recognition around not just the vehicles, but the importance of the charging infrastructure and the access to that, both in public places and at people's homes. Next slide, please. The electricity sector you can read the recommendations on the slide. I will note that this area has had, relative to the other sectors, a little bit less in the way of significant new recommendations, because the primary recommendation from the first climate action plan for Vermont to adopt a 100% renewable or clean energy standard happened in the last legislative session, which with the revisions to the renewable energy standard, and that has us on a path to have 100% renewable energy by 2035 being the primary strategy to reduce emissions from our electricity portfolio. I would go a little bit more in detail, but I recognize that I am at time and I don't want to cut into the time of others, but I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Jared. Yeah, I know we're throwing a lot at you, but again, going to encourage you to attend the April public events, and we're going to transition to hear from Jael Pulskamp, who again represents the farm and forest sector in her role as co-chair of the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee, really important component of this work. So Jael, give us a sense of the top level recommendations at this point from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's great to have you here, and I'm really pleased to be here. And so the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee was, so in the old plan, we had over 150 pathways, actions, and strategies. And so we were tasked with trying to reduce those to a dozen or so. And so it was very challenging. We ended up breaking out into 3 different task groups. And so the first task group was reduce and sequester. The second one was support adaptation. And the third one was climate resilient land. And so each of those task groups read through the recommended pathways, strategies, and actions and kind of whittled it down. So what I'm about to present is just a snapshot, really, of what we discussed. And today I'm only going to review 3 of our, top priorities. So agriculture is important to the state. Forestry is important. And we are really a rural state, and our working lands and our ecosystems are also really important. When I say working lands, our ecosystems that are working for us. Then we also have our working land sector, which is agriculture and forestry. So in Vermont, our ag sector accounts for about 16% of greenhouse gas emissions. And then of that 16%, 48% of that is from enteric fermentation. And that's like burps and farts from cows. So that comes from cows. And then 26% is from manure management. So manure pits, manure just piled up on the farm. 23% is from managed ag soils. So how, like tillage and how the land, if it's not cover cropped or something, that releases, every time land is tilled, it releases CO2. And then a small percentage is from liming and urea fertilization. So spreading lime or spreading fertilizer, and then also from the manufacturing of fertilizer. So for our committee, we're looking at what can we do to reduce those emissions from ag, but then also how can we employ nature-based solutions to help sequester more carbon, and what kind of practices can our farmers and our foresters implement to help those natural systems. We have great potential here in Vermont to sequester more carbon, and sequestration means like to draw down the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, predominantly CO2, because plants through photosynthesis can draw down CO2. They consume CO2 and then send it into the roots and then send it into minerals in the soil where it can be stored for a very long time. So how can we support our natural systems to do more of that? And it's tricky because we have our enterprises that rely on usually extracting from the land, so our foresters and our farmers, and in that they can sometimes, they release carbon into the atmosphere. So we want to encourage them to do things in a way that's going to not destroy our natural systems in doing what they do really well in sequestering carbon. So this first pathway that is displayed is increase funding and enhance and adapt existing state of Vermont programs that support greenhouse gas emissions reduction, soil carbon sequestration, and climate adaptation and resiliency on working lands. And so the state of Vermont already has a lot of programs to help farmers, especially. We definitely need to expand those programs to cover forestry. But right now we have a lot of programs to help farmers implement different practices on their land that are going to help sequester more carbon, such as tilling less, planting cover crops, planting out riparian buffers. So those are strips of vegetative strips, usually along waterways on farms. And so we have a lot of these programs that farmers can access to so that they can institute these, what we call climate smart practices. It's, we want to incentivize farmers to engage with these programs rather than create some sort of regulatory burden on them, and encourage them to adapt these practices. Sometimes it does require more labor or more time, and so we want to compensate farmers fairly for making those changes. So this recommendation, if you look at it in its full form, lists out all those different programs that Vermont offers. So the second slide, which is the second slide. So the other thing is we really want to support our working land enterprises, because if our farmers and our foresters go out of business, then in a lot of ways, they keep our state rural. Those enterprises help keep our state rural and actually help keep, you know, our wild lands. A lot of farms actually have forest on them. So if we can keep those lands working, then they won't be sold and developed. And that's where we really lose a lot of our working lands is with development. So this next pathway is to support those businesses so that farmers and foresters can you know stay in business and have good incomes and continue to work the land. And so this pathway is to get the state to dedicate robust funding for farm and forestry supply chain resilience and state food security, including significant investment in storage, processing, distribution, and distribution infrastructure, and then prioritize investments in farm, food, and forestry businesses, cooperatives, nonprofits, tribes, community projects that have climate resilience, adaptation, and mitigation goals. And there's, again, a little more to this pathway, but to also help support food assistance programs so that we can help Vermonters access more of that locally produced food, which then helps grow our local economy. So the mission of this pathway is to really just find ways to support those enterprises and to make sure that they continue to be profitable. And then the last slide I'm going to discuss is so Joey mentioned earlier about the just transition pathways, and so a part of this is recognizing you know that this land historically was managed and cared for by Indigenous people, and they had a special relationship with the land and how the land was managed and how they harvested food from it. And so looking at ways to take that knowledge, which is called traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, and to apply it to the way that we manage our lands today. And so engaging those organizations and those individuals in helping us design these programs. So, you know, we want to encourage the state agencies to prioritize and incentivize through various financial mechanisms, nature-based solutions, and traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and for addressing climate change impacts. So, you know, basically, you know, looking at when we're reviewing scientific papers to also look at like what would the perspective be, the Indigenous perspective be on managing land or forest, and helping those ecosystems thrive, and then enhancing those nature-based solutions. So that's basically what we've been working on. And again, it's challenging because we want to protect as much of our land, our wild lands as we can, but we also want to have enough land to grow food, to feed our communities and have wood products. So there's kind of these contradictory goals we have that we needed to assess. And so it made the work a little challenging, but we really encourage the public to engage and to review all the different recommended pathways and to offer input. So thank you.
Thank you, Jael. Keep the questions coming. And yeah, it is a lot. And this is high-level overview of the draft recommendations. And at the end, we're going to point you directly to other public engagement opportunities being led by the Climate Action Office in service of this important work. But to round it out, I want to turn it over to David Mears, who's a member of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, to give a high-level overview of some of the thinking that they're putting forward in terms of critical next priority steps to harness and really, focus on resilience and adaptation in a warming world. Take it away, David. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Joey. And thanks, Jael and Jared, for your presentations. Just before I talk about rural resilience, I can't help but just stress that in response to the ag and ecosystem recommendations, that how critical it is to put some of those just on equal par with some of the recommendations around carbon reductions and mitigation. One of Vermont's absolute superpowers is our landscape, our forested, farmed landscape, both in terms of the natural functions, as Jael pointed out, but also in terms of the sustainability of it. And the more we are supporting and investing in the kind of economic viability of the systems that keep that land open and undeveloped and providing, benefits to our communities, the better off we'll be in terms of adaptation and resilience. So it's very directly related to the rural resilience question. One little caveat is that I didn't participate actively in the subcommittee work when these recommendations were developed. I'll give credit to Chris Campany, who's the Wyndham Regional Planning Commission, and to Andrea Wright, who's a senior policy manager at the Agency of Transportation, and the whole subcommittee, who did a ton of work to pull this together. But I can tell you, having spent the last few months digging into them and working through them and hashing them over with folks, I'm absolutely convinced these are the right set of recommendations and the right themes. And they may need to get pared down and reworked slightly, but I'll just share my own personal opinion, not on behalf of the Climate Council. I think these are headed in the right direction. So as we think about community, resilience, rural communities, I think three themes kind of come out through the recommendations, and I won't go through all of them because there's too many to kind of recite them all in the time that we have. But some things that jump out are, that may seem obvious, but plan ahead, invest in planning. The more you plan, the better. We know, it may, whatever our opinions are about whether climate change is real or whatever silly arguments are out there this week. The changing climate doesn't really care whether we believe it or not. We are seeing the increased, intensity and frequency of extreme weather events. And as Dr. Leslie Ann Dupigny-Giroux at University of Vermont and the state climatologist has pointed out, it's not just floods either. We need to plan for and think about drought, fire, ice, public health, infectious diseases. There's a whole variety of things coming our way that we need to be prepared for. So how do we do that? We have in Vermont a system of governance that puts a lot of load on local government. So in addition to planning ahead, another piece of it is we need to really think about how do we invest in the communities and the systems of governance that we have that are responding to these and are making decisions about how our communities are built and look. And that requires a lot of integration across communities at a regional level, which means we also need to invest in our regional planning commissions and regional structures. So those are kind of three themes that come out. One, we need to plan ahead and invest in it and make it real. We need to really support our communities, local governments. And three, we need to figure out how to strengthen the connections between at the regional level among communities, and then from the regional to the state. So I'll give some examples of things that kind of demonstrate this from the recommendations. That we need to give more state grants, more technical assistance, toolkits to local governments to do more local planning, to support, for instance, the hazard mitigation planning. And that is both, important from the sense of how communities make decisions about land use, about where they're going to build, where they're going to invest in infrastructure. But it also has very practical considerations in that if we don't provide a more dedicated form of state funding, we're not going to be able to match the federal funds that are available in the aftermath of federally declared disasters. So there's a need to really think about how we equip communities to be prepared to take advantage of that funding. One of the ironies in Vermont is that we have communities that are completely hammered, for instance, by flooding, whether it was Tropical Storm Irene or the last couple of July floods. And the communities that most need the help are the least able to kind of pull it together. We're relying on local select boards, volunteers, not necessarily with expertise, background, or resources to take advantage of some of the federal funding and opportunities. So we need to figure out how, as a state, to invest in helping those communities be ready. Another example is related to the business community. Small businesses are frequently some of the hardest hit in our downtowns and village centers when there's flood events, and they're also the backbones of our communities and essential to kind of community vitality. So we need to figure out, how do we help form networks and supports for those businesses that aren't eligible for some of the public funding, but how do we create structures and governance systems that support them as they are preparing and responding to floods or other disasters. I'll just touch, there's a few other things related to kind of preparedness, including being prepared for where are we going to need to make the most important investments for housing or infrastructure. And there's a whole set of recommendations that talk about transportation infrastructure, the electric grid, water, wastewater, sewer, stormwater infrastructure, that we know all of these forms of infrastructure are hammered in the aftermath of flood events and often as a result of other forms of disaster. And we need to be prepared for that and think ahead. When Chris Cole was the Secretary of Transportation, he did some work after Irene and historically and looked at, when do we as a state invest in infrastructure repairs? Well, it turns out there's these spikes every time that there is a major disaster is when we invest in infrastructure repairs. It's not methodical, it's not steady, it's not planned ahead. It's just in response to an emergency. And we know that putting stuff back the way it was is not the way we need to build into the future. So thinking about how we plan for that, and then how do we anticipate the fact that there's going to be a flood of money that comes into the state in the aftermath of an emergency. How are we prepared to spend that money wisely? And then the last area I'll talk about is public health. That, when you think about part of what drives our responses to flood emergencies or fires or droughts is the stories, the anecdotes, the real people that are most immediately impacted. And the people who are most impacted, of course, are disproportionately vulnerable based on their income level or race or background or geographic location. And we need to anticipate that and be prepared to respond to those emergencies more effectively and help those communities be more resilient. And that means better training, better funding at the local and regional level to support that kind of work. So that's a very quick and broad overview of a much more sophisticated set of recommendations. Happy to answer questions and engage in more discussion.
Thank you so much, David. Very much appreciate that. Evelyn, maybe we can stop sharing. And yes, just encouraging you all to sort of, if you have questions, please do drop them in the chat. I'm going to drop a link. I know we're throwing a ton at you, and there is a much bigger body of work that David referenced and everyone has referenced that sort of undergirds the priority recommendations. So just want to underscore for you all the sort of the ability to dig deeper, get into more detail, and show up in April and on May 1st if you are interested. But yeah, if you have further questions, please do drop them in the chat. In the meantime, I'm going to ask the one question we have so far to Jael. You answered it a little bit, but can you speak a little bit more to how that works, Jael, for Stephanie's question?
Well, so it's not regulatory. So these are really just programs that farmers can sign up for if they choose to. They're not and there are incentives. So if they do engage, they can get payments. So we're really trying to encourage that. In terms of tracking, I think Jared could talk to this a little better because it's really out of my wheelhouse, but there are some programs that are used for accounting the greenhouse gas emissions from farms, and I'm cannot recall off the top of my head what the names are of those programs, but you know, it's statewide, and looking at basically how many cows there are, and then you know, how much manure, and then accounting that. So that's how emissions are tracked. And then there's some data in terms of like, if they implement these different practices, that's going to help reduce those like enteric fermentation emissions on their farms.
Thanks, Jael. Jared, I want to invite you to round that out if you have anything else that would be helpful to offer, as Jael suggested.
Yeah, I mean, on the point that Jael just made, I think it's, you know, you know, speaking for myself, and I think many other climate counselors, in line with what Jael and David said, I think many of us recognize the importance of providing support for Vermont's ecosystems and landscape, our forest stewards and agricultural producers and the soils that they steward, to have the resources to continue for those to continue to have the support that they need to provide all of the kind of ecosystem, cultural, carbon sequestration and storage benefits that they do. It is complicated when you get to talking about greenhouse gas emissions tracking and inventories. You know, oftentimes people wonder why is it that the official greenhouse gas inventory for the state of Vermont is on a 3-year delay, when a lot of this data we know right away. Certain, you know, we know on with only a month time lag, total fossil fuel sales from the transportation and thermal sectors. And really that 3-year time lag is because the agriculture sector emissions estimates are the hardest to estimate, the most complicated, and we rely on an Environmental Protection Agency tool, and we don't really know the future of that. And it's just, it's inherently more complex and uncertain, trying to estimate sources and sinks of emissions cycling through land, whether it's forest or ag soils, than it is understanding gallons of fuel sold and their well-established emissions factors. And so we need to find a way to have fidelity and confidence in the data on the emissions side, while also ensuring ways to provide appropriate incentives and support on the land side, is my opinion.
Thank you, Jared. Please do keep the questions coming. If you don't have them, that's fine. We're going to wrap with some more information about the public engagement opportunities, but I want to ask David Mears to try to tackle the next 2 questions that are related to federal funding, looking like federal funding is going to dry up. What's the thinking about how Vermont will deal with resilient infrastructure funding, if you've had conversations, and then also a little bit more broadly, speaking to, and I want to offer this to Jael and Jared as well, just discussions within the Climate Council about the huge change in the federal landscape and the funding dynamics. So, and how that relates to emergency response as well. So David, if I can implore you to sort of try to tackle these questions separately.
Yeah, happy to. Well, they're unanswerable questions. Well, what to do about the loss of federal funding is an unanswerable question, but I'll take a run at the thinking. But in terms of the process piece, the Climate Council has touched on the issue of the change in the federal funding scheme, but we haven't really taken the time yet to dive more deeply into that and how that will affect our recommendations. I expect we'll be doing that in the coming weeks. I'll share. So the remainder of this is my, take with a grain of salt. It's my own, opinion that's informed by no more or no less than the material available to anybody out there that reads the news. but it would be absolutely, utterly catastrophic for Vermont and every state across the country if we lose federal emergency response funding, whether it's the mitigation and planning piece of that funding or the actual response and recovery in the aftermath of an actual flood. The role that FEMA plays, the role that EPA, that the Natural Resources Conservation Services, the result is that so many different federal agencies play in terms of providing funding to assist a state like Vermont, and particularly a rural state like Vermont. In response, we could not, I cannot imagine that we could replace that level of funding, technical assistance and support that we get from the federal level. I can't, there's been such long-standing bipartisan support for that kind of response. It's also beyond my comprehension to imagine that that funding will not be restored. But what do I know? I would not have anticipated that we would be even having to answer that question at this moment. So we'll see, but I think it's a much larger question than the Climate Council can answer. There's, basic systems of our basic system of government seems to be shifting under our feet. So we'll see. But I do expect the Climate Council will be talking about it. If nothing else, it reinforces the number of the proposals across each of the different areas that we're working in, many of which involve investing more in state grants and funding to support whether it's local governments or foresters or farmers or others in being prepared for and responding to the climate crisis.
Thank you so much, David. I don't know if Jared or Jael, you have anything else to add. I appreciate that. And these are indeed uncertain and perilous times. So Jared or Jael, anything else to add on that front?
It's complex and I don't want to get too in the weeds here. But we do get some funding for our programs, for the ag programs through NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And those programs are really popular with farmers. And so if the USDA were to try and cut those, or the federal government were to try and cut those, there would be a lot of outcry among the agricultural community. So there was a lot of money through the IRA to help farmers implement climate smart practices. Those were cut. There was huge outcry. They were, it looks like they're going to be funded, and they might just get rolled into the conservation practices that our NRCS already has. So, like I said, they're popular, so I don't think they'll get cut. We can't use the word climate. We have to use the word conservation when we're talking about this. So that's kind of the biggest change that we're facing. I mean, there are some cuts here and there, but I'm hoping that they refund everything.
Thank you, Jael. I'm going to take a stab at Richard's question, which is right now we're having trouble seeking a contractor to address the Municipal Energy Resilience Program project. What's being thought about related to workforce development? Thank you so much for asking that question, Richard, and raising that issue. I failed to sort of underscore that there is also a very important body of work and some recommendations related to, as I mentioned, some cross-cutting issues. Workforce development is one of those really important cross-cutting issues that is recognized, as you have noted, as fundamental to doing the work that we need to do when we're talking about the clean energy transition. Having a trained workforce to be able to show up to weatherize your home or install a heat pump or to rebuild or ensure that there are critical infrastructure elements. So workforce development is one of those cross-cutting recommendations. I shared a link in the chat to a lot more detail for anyone who wants to go more deeply into the recommendations that were at that point on March 10th, the current status. But I want to also highlight that there's also a few other things in the cross-cutting sector and bucket of work related to the recognition of compact communities and compact community settlement and land use practices being really important to cutting climate pollution over the long term, giving people opportunity to live near where they work or play or services. So a bucket of compact community settlement strategies, as well as one other and a potentially fourth, a bucket of recommendations related to education, knowing that we need to really make sure that all Vermonters are informed by and partners in developing and implementing the solutions. So recommendations related to education, and then potentially there may be a consideration of sort of financing strategies to make sure that we are able to do the broad-based suite of climate action strategies we know we're going to need, but that we're leveraging private capital to ensure that we can do this work in the most cost-effective and affordable way possible. That is a priority for all of us. It is possible. We know we need to do this work. Vermont is uniquely situated. So thank you for that question. I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to sort of begin to transition us. We're almost at time anyway, but there is so much really good work that has been put together by members of the Climate Council, informed to date by very important public input in a variety of ways, including through the leadership of the Climate Action Office, really doing good and deep work with partners to try to meet Vermonters where they are, so that we are engaging a more broad suite of Vermonters that is really representative of everyone in this state, and that this work is informed by everyone. So that's what I want to end with. There are some public engagement events, as we've mentioned. I'm going to drop the link right here in the chat. Oh, sorry. There's many a link here. But those public engagement events start with a virtual event in early April. And then there's a series of 7 in-person events. There will be Climate Council members at each of them there to listen and learn from the public about their preferred priorities when we're talking about climate pollution and reduction strategies. Thank you, Evelyn, for your support today and pulling this together, and for showcasing this. And again, just encouraging you all to show up and speak up at these upcoming public engagement events in April, concluding on May 1st with one last virtual event. Really important to make your voice heard. The Climate Council has and will continue to really reflect on the public input so that we can develop the best plan for these fairly perilous times and set Vermonters in our state up for success in a warming world, and move people off of imported fossil fuels that are bad for public health and our economy. So we have an opportunity before us. I'm really grateful for Jared, Jael, and David for showing up, wearing your independent counselor hat. Again, we're not we are not speaking for the Climate Council, but they've played very important roles, rolling up their sleeves, trying to figure this out with a lot of different people. And I'm grateful for their time today and their leadership in this work. And we're all in this together. So, let's make sure that we continue to lean into each other, our community, and the priorities that we have before us when it comes to climate action, and so many other things that are fundamental for a healthy and thriving people and planet. So grateful for your time today. And to be clear, not sure exactly why how all of the locations were set to your question, Linda, but to the degree people are able to go to the closest in-person event, highly recommend that, and otherwise show up at the virtual sessions on April 10th or May 1st. So yeah, thank you again for your time today. Thank you again. Free food and kids activities at the events. And that reminds me, Allie, just letting people know that these public events are put together in partnership with our regional planning commissions, who are really important partners in this process, and more so to their communities who are doing all kinds of really important work when it comes to planning projects and program implementation that serves Vermont and Vermonters. So thank you again for your time, for your questions, for your participation, and thank you in advance for showing up in April. thanks to the Association of Vermont Conservation Commissions for the work that you do, your partnership on this event, and look forward to collaborating with so many of you in the coming weeks and years. So thanks again. Have a great day, all.